Hello and welcome everyone to Vlogmas Day 5. My throat is still a little sore, but I figured for today's video I would do something that I've gotten a lot of questions about, which is my favorite 1960s and 1970s biographies. And in the end, I'm also going to talk a little bit about my two favorite novels from that time. So if you're interested in all of that, then this video is for you. I figured I would start this video with the one book that really helped me spark my love for the 1960s, and that is Wonderful Tonight, George Harrison, Eric Clapton and Me by Pattie Boyd. So this book is a beautiful biography. I love how it also has pages with pictures in here, and in that book Pattie basically tells a story from how she grew up to how she got into modeling. It's also about how she met George Harrison and became part of the Beatles circle, how she became that really popular 1960s figure. It's also about how kind of heartbreaking it was for her when that relationship and marriage with George Harrison fell apart, and her very troubled relationship with Eric Clapton. The one thing that I love the most about this book is how honest she is and how she tries to be so understanding with everyone. I feel like with memoirs, sometimes you run into that situation where people kind of trash other people, and she's just so gentle and kind and understanding with everyone, and I feel like that really paints her as a person. So this book to me is a big must read. It also has very private insight into her life in Kinfonz and how she felt when George Harrison basically told her that he didn't want her to work anymore. He didn't want her to be a model anymore and be away, and how she kind of stepped back for him, and then she kind of felt like she was losing herself. So this book is a lot about how to lose yourself, how to find yourself, and I feel like that is very, very beautiful and just a very inspiring story. It is beautifully written and just an absolute must read. Pattie Boyd obviously is a 1960s icon. Her fashion, her sense of just being, and her spirit is what makes me really interested in the time period. She's one of my biggest role models. She also recently came out with another book, but you cannot get that in Germany yet, so I ordered it, but it's gonna take a couple weeks to be shipped, but I bet that will be just as amazing as this one is. So I don't have all of the books here physically with me that I've read and all of the biographies that I've loved, because I go to the public library a lot, and I think that's always a great way. But another biography that I loved was Memories, Dreams and Reflections by Marianne Faithfull. This retrieving autobiography charts Marianne's life from her earliest childhood dream to 1994. So it captures a really big span of time, which I think is really interesting because you can definitely tell how she changed as a person in that time. It gives you such a wonderful insight into the history of swinging London in the 1960s. And her thoughts and feelings on being in the music industry during that time. Her recollections of touring with the popular bands of that time, especially the Rolling Stones, are absolutely magnificent and make you feel like you truly were there. One of my favorite stories in the book is how she recalls meeting Bob Dylan for the first time. And then there's this other story where she tells how she met him again in the 80s, and she explained every song from her 1979 record Broken English to him, and he was so fascinated and said that it was one of his favorite records, which made her feel really proud. So that's a very standout moment for me in this book. I take notes with pretty much every book that I read, and with this book, this was just something that really stood out to me. The glimpses that she gives into the personal relations of the Stones, and especially the ill-fated life of Brian Jones, is so touching and interesting. It truly feels like you're there, and you kind of try to understand how these people who were so close with each other and worked with each other and spent every day with each other were just this big friend group, and then with the pressure and becoming famous, how it kind of fell apart and how heartbreaking it was for every one of the members to let go of Brian Jones. She also talks very openly about her relationship with Mick Jagger and all the drug busts that they went through, and she doesn't really spare you any detail of why that relationship was so wonderful for her, but then also so dangerous at the same time. So I feel like it's a very toxic relationship where both of these people loved each other very much, but weren't good for one another. What I think is beautiful about this book is that in Marianne's writing there is no bitterness. She's full of praise for musicians like Barry Reynolds and Van Morrison with whom she worked. And she also goes into detail about who slept with whom in the popular 1960s circle of the Rolling Stones. To me personally, if you're a fan of the 60s and that era, this book is a true must-read. She is so open, honest, and warm-hearted with the way that she talks about her life, writing about the good times, but she also doesn't shy away from telling you about the bad times and how horrible it was sometimes. But with all of that writing, there never comes a bitter feeling. To me, this book truly shows who Marianne is and was, and how and why she became such a popular figure in the 1960s. I feel like she was so iconic for her style, but then she also wasn't as popular with her music because back then it was still really hard for women to be so popular, and she was often kind of reduced on her look. And so I feel like this book is really, really wonderful to understand her as a person. I feel like we cannot talk about the 1960s and its popular figures without talking about one Anita Pallenberg. She is such an interesting person to me. There is something so intriguing to me about her, and I felt like there isn't a person from the 60s who is more deserving of a biography and trying to be able to explain themselves than Anita Pallenberg. So I was really happy when I found out that there was a biography about her. So I'm gonna be honest, I don't personally love biographies that aren't written by the person themselves, which is why you won't find any Beatles biographies or memoirs in this video. But I feel like this book by Nicholas Roeg really tries to take an insight on who she was. He talked to a lot of different people. He kind of goes into these stories and myths and tries to really picture her as a person, and also kind of tries to put her in a better light than what she usually is put in. And I feel like that is very important because she's often just seen as that drug addict who kind of destroyed the Rolling Stones, and I feel like this book really shows you a more depth insight on who she was. So the book starts with some really interesting information about her upbringing. It goes into depth about her childhood in Rome and how she lived among the La Dolce Vita crowd. I did find the chapter on the cult film Performance incredible because it has been one of my favorite movies for such a long time, and so I thought it was really interesting to learn more about that. I feel like if there's one thing that this book taught me about Anita Pallenberg, is that she was a fascinating but disturbing woman, especially during her 1960s to 1970s heyday. The book especially details all the Anita, mad woman, witch, satanist. They call her really bad words. All of these tales are kind of really good detailed in this book, but it also really shows you how many people who knew her seem to have been swept away by her charm and well-defined sense of humor. So I well believe that there was a really special charisma about her, because even though there are so many negative stories and tales about her, there were so many people who speak really well of her and seem to have her in a really special place in their hearts. The book obviously also tells about her uncanny beauty. I mean, she was really famous for being beautiful, but what I personally liked about the book is that it also tells you that she just was a very intelligent and strong woman. And yet there was something very disturbing about her. I feel like you can definitely tell from the pictures, from pretty much all the stories about her, and the book doesn't shy away from that. To me personally, it wasn't her drug addiction that seemed the most disturbing, but rather her drive to manipulate everyone, especially those she loved the most. When you listen to the Stones' music, you can definitely feel her presence, and I feel like they made such wonderful songs about her that her presence still is very positive. But she was definitely someone who had a lot of facets to them and who isn't really easy to be broken down into a book. However, this book left me even more fascinated by her. I'm personally really hoping that there is going to be another, more thorough biography written about her that goes way more into depth, because I feel like this book is really interesting, but there has to be so much more to this woman. However, this book left me baffled, and this book left me with a really interesting feeling. On one hand, I feel like it is valid that people criticize her so much, but then on the other hand, I feel like she was misunderstood a lot. And I kind of felt like she felt that she needed to be better than herself. So I feel like that book is also a lot about someone who probably was deeply insecure inside and who was just trying to hide that by manipulating others. However, this book also tells you how wonderfully charismatic she was, and I feel like she wasn't an easy person, but this book also tells you how she and her complex character were loved by so many people. Let's move on with another book that I have in physical form right here. This is I'm With the Band by Pamela DeBar, a groupie classic. This book too has some pictures, just like the Pattie Boyd one. Most of these biographies actually have. And this is a very, very interesting book. It starts with Pamela being a Beatles-obsessed teenager, and then it's basically just about how this music-loving teenager gets involved in the music industry in the 1970s. It tells about the beginning, how she was with Frank Zappa and used to work for him. It details how they founded the GTOs, this wonderful women-empowering groupie group. It also goes very much into depth about how she spent so much time with Led Zeppelin and all the adventures she went on with them. And then it basically just goes even beyond that and how she still kind of tries to live that lifestyle. So for me, Miss Pamela has always been a fascinating character. We actually have a friend in common who tells me a lot about her. I have a shawl that she gifted to me and some other things, and I'm gonna be honest, she seems like such a genuine and sweet person. I also love that this book is extremely raw and doesn't really shy back from all the sex, drugs, and rock and roll stories you might want to hear. If you're interested in that, this book is definitely for you. But it also just tells the story of this young girl who had all of these dreams of being involved in the music industry and how she makes her dreams come true. And she truly builds the life that she always wanted. So if you're interested in learning more about groupies, I cannot recommend you this wonderful book enough. Speaking of Miss Pamela and the GTOs, here's another memoir written by the GTOs, which is Miss Mercy's book, Permanent Damage, Memoirs of an Outrageous Girl. So just like Pamela and I, Mercy and I have that same friend in common. And he tells me a lot about Mercy because she passed away in 2020, which I feel like we've talked a lot about how wonderful of a person she was. And it truly breaks my heart that I will never have the chance to meet her. So Miss Mercy has always been a huge inspiration for me, so I was stoked to find out that she wrote a memoir. So sadly I couldn't find her memoir in Germany, so I listened to it on Audible. That's a possibility too. And I remember that it was like 6 hours long and I finished it in one sitting. I was so fascinated by it, I couldn't put it on pause. This book tells you these almost unbelievable tell-all stories about the most outrageous stories of the GTOs. Miss Mercy definitely was a fascinating person who was as much of an LA legend as Whiskey A Go-Go or all the other fab establishments of that time. She spent a lot of time with both rock and soul legend and was a complex individual with a troubled childhood and complex romantic relationships. I feel like what makes her and her book so special is that throughout these world-winding times of 1960s and 70s West Coast rock moments, she was always painfully herself. So this book, I feel like, is one of the most honest and true books I've ever read about the time. She was that chameleon who could fit into all these different roles. She was what people wanted to see in her, but she always was herself. So she kind of hops from all of these amazing stories. She managed to look so different in all of these wonderful pictures of her, but she kind of always keeps herself at the core, that wonderful and unique Miss Mercy look. She was a style icon of the time, and she even was the one who came up with Alice Cooper's original look and influenced Paul Stanley's stage makeup. One thing about this book that moved me to tears was Miss Pamela's heartfelt and touching afterwards. So the way that she talks about her friend and all these times that they spent together is so touching and just gives you such a beautiful insight on who these people really were. Because I feel like a lot of the time with groupies especially, they're just seen as these like sex symbols, kind of girls hanging out with these rock stars, but they aren't really seen for who they were as true people. And so I feel like this book, just like the one Miss P wrote, are just very, very open and honest and give an insight on that these were in fact real people and how incredible they were. And not only how incredibly beautiful they were, but also how much they influenced that time of the 1960s and 70s and the music scene. I feel like the book really captures her essence, including her painful past, all the strength, intelligence, and courage that she had and that impacted her life so much, and how she was always herself. The book doesn't really always paint a pretty picture, but I feel like life in Hollywood and Laurel Canyon wasn't always beautiful at the time either. So it's just a very honest depiction of the time. Mercy left a mark on the music scene, and no one who'd ever met her was able to forget her. Next up, let's talk about a book written by the woman who I now share a hairstyle with, Grace Slick, and her memoir, Someone to Love, a Rock and Roll Memoir. So this book came out in 1998, and she just kind of takes a look back at her life. It starts with young Grace finishing school in New York, working in a department store, and eventually getting married. You can't help but feel with her not fitting in with this life. She talks about how her first band, Great Society, existed in parallel with the legendary but much more better and advanced professional Jefferson Airplane, and how she finally joined Jefferson Airplane, bringing the hits White Rabbit and Somebody to Love with her. One story of the book that I kept in mind in particular was her detailing how she tried to smuggle Abby Hoffman into the White House to spike Nixon's drink with LSD. Unfortunately, the Secret Service nipped that in the bud. However, the story just tells so much about who this strong woman was, and how she always kind of was there for fun, and how she kind of didn't take life too seriously, but then she also truly knew what she wanted from life. She talks about her drug addiction and how she got sober in the 80s, and how they reunited Jefferson's Starship one more time to ride off in the sunset forever. I love this book because it tells the story of a woman who was always unapologetically herself, and how she found her place in the world. So as said in the beginning, you kind of get that feeling of this young girl with all of her dreams and hopes, and how she just doesn't fit in with the classic life. It starts with her not being happy because she doesn't have the 1950s classic hourglass shaped body, and how she felt really insecure about that, and how she never felt like she would fit in, and then finally found her place with Jefferson Airplane, making music that would last for an eternity. So far, these were all biographies by women. I personally feel like it's often a more interesting insight at the time. However, there are two biographies especially written by men that I really enjoyed. And the first one is The Road to Woodstock by Michael Lang. Michael Lang, if you don't know, was the guy who founded the first Woodstock and organized it. And the most impressive thing about this book is how Michael Lang managed to keep his cool not only in the week leading up to Woodstock, but also during the event. So there were some things that didn't go as planned. You probably know this is the most legendary festival of the time, but he really managed to keep his cool. And I feel like by always being so calm with everything, he was the one that really made this happen. There were so many things that could have wrecked Woodstock and everyone else's plans. Any normal models would have thrown the towel. So you really feel like it is so overwhelming to organize this. There were so many anecdotes in the books, money hassles, ego clashing. There was just so much going wrong with the preparation and the festival, but he always kept his cool because he had this vision of bringing all of these wonderful musicians together, and he never failed. I love the film and the triple album, and I feel like we can all agree that there will never be another festival like this. And so I love how organizer Michael Lang details how exactly everything went down. And even though it is so detailed, it's never boring because he has such a witty way of writing. This was a great insight into a legendary festival, and Michael Lang has now sadly passed away. But I feel like it is important that he wrote this book because everyone knows about Woodstock, but not a lot of people know about the guy behind it, that one man who kind of brought the vision to life. So if you're a big fan of Woodstock and the festival, I would really recommend you to read this wonderful book. So let me tell you about the final biography before we then switch to novels. So to me personally, probably the best biography ever written by a rock star is Life by Keith Richards. This book has 736 pages and it is filled with anecdotes about his childhood and the Rolling Stones. I also read Stone Alone by Bill Wyman and Ronnie by Ron Wood. However, I think that Life by Keith Richards is by far the best because it makes you live through the stories instead of just listing happenings. With every page, you're able to feel how much Keith loved life and just doing what he loves. It also beautifully tells how little Keith started to pick up the guitar and dreamed of being a musician. He doesn't try to be friendly or get a lot of likes with this book. He is just unapologetically himself. I feel like he's definitely pissing off people with this book, but he's just being rough and honest, and I feel like that is probably who he really is. While reading this book, it truly feels like you're there. It feels like you're sitting between Keith and Mick while they write all of these incredible Rolling Stones songs. It also tells of his heartbreaking love to Anita Pallenberg, who was just like him, struggling with heroin addiction at the time. And I feel like reading this and then the other book about Anita Pallenberg gives you a great insight because, as said, there are so many negative kind of witch satanic tales about her, but this book really shows you how much he must have loved her, because it's just the story of these two people who go through so many years of addiction, trying to get better and all of that together. And I feel like he always paints a pretty positive picture of her. And I feel like you really need to take that into consideration when you read about her and all of these rather negative stories. Because in Life by Keith Richards, you can just feel that there was so much love between these two. So Keith Richards also details how it got harder working with Mick as his ego became bigger and bigger, and how their friendship made it through all of this anyway. I feel like this is actually one of the most interesting pieces of this book. The entire dynamic of the Rolling Stones. So he tells of all the different members and how it wasn't always easy. I mean, I said it before that the Marianne Faithfull biography also touches on that topic of Brian Jones and how much of a troubled person he was, especially right before his death, where he was only 27 when he passed away. And I feel like this book also talks about that. And then he also writes really openly about the friendships between the different members and how it wasn't always easy with especially Mick, who was so much more famous than the rest and was kind of this pin-up figure for the Rolling Stones, but they kind of managed to always put their friendship first, and so they saved this friendship. And I mean, they're still touring, they're still friends, so they definitely have a lifelong bond. To me personally, this is a beautiful and touching memoir that makes you laugh and cry. It is filled with wonderful stories, touching stories, moments where you feel how desperate he was in his life. For me, this truly is a must-read for all 60s music fans, especially if you're a fan of the Rolling Stones, because no hate to Bill or Ronnie, but this is hands down the best biography. So I love to read 60s biographies, but I also love to read 60s books. Not only books about the time, but especially books that were published in the 1960s and that were really popular at the time. So for example, Truman Capote's Cold Hearted, or To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. However, there are two novels that really stand out to me from that time. Both of these novels I've read in a couple of days because I was so fascinated and couldn't put it down. And the first one is the legendary Valley of the Dolls. So I can honestly just tell you that this book is addictive. I love that it isn't just another glamorizing, all is peachy and perfect story, but it gets so real and tells you what life really is like. To be quite honest, this is one of my favorite books. I reread it all the time. I don't have it here currently because, as said, you can get these at the public library, so why have more things than you need? I could definitely get a copy, but then I'm also like, I already have so many things and I can just go there and take it with me home and read it again and again and again. This book is about some young beauty queens trying to become famous, but it's really told without all the glitter and glamour and mainly focuses on the ups and downs of life. On its initial release, Valley of the Dolls was roundly denigrated by literacy critics as nothing but trash. And to be honest, they were a little right, because this book isn't a high art modernist novel at all. This book is all about sex, celebrities, drugs, money, and a Puritan moralization that makes every character suffer for their pleasure throughout this entire book. It's terrifically entertaining, often hilarious, and always over the top. It's a pop cultural staple from the 60s, not only because of the famous movie starring the beautiful Sharon Tate, but also because of how timeless it is. I've read this book many times, and as said, I will read it over and over again, and with every read I enjoy it more. So I cannot recommend you to read this book enough. So the final book that I want to talk about today is The L-Shaped Room by Lynne Reid Banks. So this book probably is now more topical than ever. The book tells the story of a young woman in her mid-20s who gets pregnant and then kicked out. She arrives alone at a run-down boarding house in London after being turned out of her comfortable middle-class home by her father after she told him that she was pregnant and she was unmarried at the time. The L-shaped room is the dingy room at the top of the boarding house that the main character Jane retreats to wallow in her misery. Jane narrates the story as we follow her through her pregnancy and her encounters with the other residents of the boarding house. All of these people are misfits and outsiders, and it is so interesting to see how she kind of finds her place with that new crowd in her new life. So other than being really well written and just a really interesting story overall, this book gives an interesting insight into the 1960s before abortion was legal. And with everything that's going on right now, I truly believe that this book now maybe is more topical than ever. So that's it for today's video and today's Vlogmas. I'm just gonna try to let my voice rest and just get fully healthy for the next days to come. But I really hope you enjoyed this video. As said, with Vlogmas, I'm trying to do a mixture of vlogs and then these like sit down videos. And this video about 1960s books was so highly requested that I figured I would just film that today. So I really hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a comment down below telling me if there are any more biographies or novels from the 60s that you really love and that I should read, because I love to read and I'm always down for new books. If you enjoyed the video, I would love you to give it a thumbs up and maybe even share it with a friend. It supports me, it supports the channel, and it would truly mean the world. I hope you have a wonderful day or evening or night or whatever time that you might be watching this. Take care of yourself today, read a book, spin a record that you love, and I will see you in tomorrow's video. Bye everybody.